Imagine being told you only have 6 months to live. Not tomorrow, not next year, but 6 months. Most people would panic. Most would crumble. But not Elvis Presley. Not the king of rock and roll. It was a warm evening in Memphis. Missing date and venue, and the air outside was buzzing like an electric wire just about to snap. The crowd inside the venue didn't know the truth. They were ready to cheer, sing along, maybe even cry with joy. But what they didn't know was that backstage, Elvis was fighting a storm that no one else could see. He was standing alone in a dim hallway. It's the kind of silence that presses against your chest. The lights hummed softly, the faint scent of polish and perfume lingering in the air. His hand rested lightly on the wall, not because he wanted support, but because for the first time in decades, he needed it. The audience's murmur seeped through the thick curtains. You could feel the energy building, a tide of anticipation. But behind the curtain, everything was still. The kind of stillness that makes your heartbeat sound louder than it ever should. And Elvis. He wasn't moving. Not yet. His eyes, those unforgettable blue eyes, were calm. Not scared. Not hesitant. But calm in a way that made you feel he already knew something the world hadn't yet understood. Something that would change the way millions remembered him. A soft flicker of a flashlight came down the hall, and one of his crew moved toward him. "Sir," the doctor said. Elvis raised a hand just slightly, enough to silence the words before they could land. He had already heard every warning, every grim statistic. 6 months. That was all the time he had been told. 6 months to live. And yet here he was, dressed in his stage suit. Scarf folded neatly around his neck, guitar resting where the light would hit it just right. Hours earlier, maybe even days earlier, he must have known this night would come. The night his body would almost betray him, but his spirit would not. He took a slow breath, controlled, deliberate. The kind of breath someone takes when they're trying not to reveal just how much it hurts inside. One step forward, and the hall seemed to stretch endlessly before him. Another step, and the hum of the spotlight grew louder in his ears, reminding him that legends do not rest, not even when they are breaking from the inside. Every footstep he took echoed softly against the walls, a fragile percussion in the quiet backstage. His fingers trembled slightly, just once, before he tucked them into the pocket of his jacket. He didn't stumble. He didn't waver. But the effort was visible to anyone watching closely enough. He reached the wings of the stage and paused. A whisper of anticipation floated from the crowd beyond the curtain. They didn't know what was happening. They didn't know the battle he had just fought to even stand there. And Elvis, for a fleeting moment, allowed himself a tiny glance at the audience through the gap. Thousands of faces, smiling, waiting. Unaware, he adjusted his collar, straightened his posture, tried to ignore the faint spinning of the room, tried to convince himself that the world outside the curtain didn't matter, but it did. Every cheer, every clap, every faint gasp carried a weight he felt down to his bones. And he wasn't about to disappoint them, not now, not ever. A distant sound of equipment shifting from the stage reached him, almost a signal. He closed his eyes briefly, not to rest, not to catch his breath, but to listen to the voice inside that had been quiet for too long. It whispered something simple, yet impossible to ignore. This wasn't just another night. He knew it. Deep down, he knew this would not be an ordinary performance. The first step onto that stage would mark a choice that would define the final chapters of his life. But before he moved any further, 3 questions ran through his mind, silent and unspoken. Questions about himself, about what he owed to the world, about how much of himself he could still give. And as he exhaled slowly, letting the breath carry some of the tension away, Elvis made a decision. He would step forward, yes, but only one step at a time. One step toward the lights, one step toward the cheering crowd. One step toward the life he wasn't ready to leave behind. Because even in the shadow of the doctor's warning, even with the looming weight of mortality pressing down, he had not lost the thing that had carried him through everything: his purpose. His music, his connection to those who loved him, even from a distance. And as the curtain shifted, letting the first sliver of light touch the stage. You could almost feel the electricity in the air change. Not excitement, not fear, but awe. A hush, a moment suspended in time. Because the world was about to witness something it had never seen before and would never forget. 3 open questions, 3 unseen stakes, and 1 man determined to face them all. Elvis took another step, heart steadying, breath measured, gaze fixed. The first note had yet to sound, but the real story was already beginning. Before the night had even begun, before the lights hit the stage and the crowd held its breath, Elvis Presley had already been carrying the weight of a lifetime. Not just the fame, not just the cheers, but the life that came before it. The boy from Tupelo. The young man who had sung into a battered microphone in a small Memphis studio, dreaming of a world he didn't yet understand. He could remember it vividly, the warm hum of the record player in his childhood home, the soft creak of wooden floorboards under his mother's careful steps, the smell of fresh bread mingling with the faint scent of vinyl. Those memories were fragile, but they were alive. Tucked into the corners of his mind, ready to remind him who he really was when the world only saw the king. And now, backstage as he adjusted the folds of his scarf that had followed him from small clubs to stadiums, he felt that same mix of fragility and hope. The scarf trembled slightly in his hand, a small symbol of endurance. A lifeline connecting the man he was tonight to the boy he had been. A folded program from an early show lay nearby. A silent witness to every first cheer, every hesitant smile, every "I believe in you" moment he'd ever heard. The soft shuffle of footsteps echoed down the hallway. Crew members moved quietly, almost reverently, as if afraid the air itself might disturb the fragile bubble surrounding him. Somewhere in the distance, the faint applause from earlier sound checks lingered, barely audible. A memory of past nights that had led him to this very moment. Elvis's suit hung perfectly, pressed meticulously. His shoes glinted faintly in the backstage glow. And the faint scent of cologne mixed with the aroma of the theater itself, scent he associated with home. With anticipation, with everything that made performing sacred, and yet, even in that perfection, there was vulnerability. His chest rose and fell with a measured rhythm. The tremor in his hand betraying the quiet storm. Beneath the calm surface, this was not the first time he had faced uncertainty. He had lived through contracts that seemed impossible, audiences that doubted him, critics who tried to define him, and a personal life that often felt like it belonged to someone else. And through it all, music had been the one constant. The one thing that carried him when every other weight threatened to crush him back then. Tupelo, he had dreamed of stages like this. Of applause, of lights, of moments when his voice could carry across a room and touch hearts he hadn't even met yet. And now, decades later, standing behind the curtain, he was reminded that those dreams were never about fame. They were about connection, about touching something deeper, about living in the sound that had saved him more times than he could count. He ran a finger lightly across the scarf again, feeling the fabric that had seen every high and low. That same scarf he would clutch later on stage, trembling slightly not out of fear, but because it carried the weight of all those years. Every performance, every tear, every cheer, every heartbreak was woven into it, and he thought of the audience waiting beyond the curtains. Not just fans, but people whose lives he had unknowingly touched. The ones who had danced in their living rooms to his records, the ones who had sung along to songs that had once comforted them in lonely nights, the ones whose weddings, road trips, and heartbreaks had all carried a little of his voice. Soft footsteps echoed behind him again. A hand reached lightly for a folded program resting on a table. Elvis glanced, smiled faintly, a nostalgic smile, the kind that held both gratitude and longing. He knew that what had brought him here was not just talent, not just charm, but persistence, courage, and an unshakable devotion to music and to life itself. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the memories wash over him, the boy from Tupelo, the young performer in tiny clubs, the man who had somehow survived the crush of fame and expectation. Each memory was a note in a song only he could hear, a song that had brought him to this night, trembling but ready, fragile but undeterred, and as he opened his eyes, he saw the distant glow of the stage, the same glow that had called him for decades. He felt the first tingle of anticipation, a reminder of Act 1. Of the choice he had taken, a single step toward the choice to face the spotlight, despite what his body demanded. The same whisper from before returned, quieter now, reminding him that the story was only beginning. He picked up the scarf one last time, letting the fabric drape over his hands. A tiny shiver ran through it, a reminder of the life he had lived, the stage he was about to claim, and the courage he would need to see it through. This was the mini symbol of the night, trembling, fragile, yet full of determination. A promise to himself that he would not step back, that he would honor both the boy and the man he had become. The hallway remained quiet. Only the faint shuffle of footsteps and the distant murmur of the crowd broke the silence. But in that silence, Elvis Presley was already preparing not just for a show, but for a moment that would test everything he had learned about life, music, and resilience. He exhaled, slow, deliberate, and took another step forward. Each movement echoed the fragile hope he carried, a hope older than fame, older than applause, older than the world's love for him. That hope was what made him human, and it was what would guide him through the night. And so, as the curtain waited, the lights hummed, and the audience buzzed unknowingly. Elvis Presley stood at the threshold of something far greater than a concert. He was about to write a memory that no one watching would ever forget. The night had barely begun when the first whisper of tension hit the hall. And then it happened. A single, sharp note from the piano backstage, accidentally struck, echoed down the corridor like a warning. Every heartbeat in the room seemed to catch at once. For a moment, the audience outside had no idea what was coming. But backstage, everything shifted. The air felt heavy, almost too thick to breathe. Elvis was already moving toward the stage, each step deliberate, each breath measured. But this wasn't the confident swagger the world had seen for decades. No, tonight his walk was slower, heavier, but filled with a strange, undeniable purpose. His hands trembled not from fear, not from nerves, but from the weight of everything he had carried for a lifetime, the scarf he had clutched in Act 2. The one that had trembled in his hands backstage now became something more. Not just a piece of fabric, it was a lifeline, a reminder of his journey. The bridge between the boy who had sung in Tupelo and the man about to face the impossible. He brushed it across his shoulder, letting it fall gently, almost ceremoniously, as if acknowledging the ghosts of every stage, every show, every expectation. And then it struck him. The lights outside, the roar of thousands waiting, the flood of anticipation, it all collided with the frailty of his own body. His legs shook beneath him. One hand found the edge of the curtain, gripping it like a tether. The audience wouldn't see it, but backstage the tremor was visible. And yet still he moved forward. The band, sensing the fragility in the room, paused. The sound of a soft strum from a guitar on standby echoed faintly, a symbolic reminder of the music that had saved him, that had carried him from hope to fame and back to himself. That guitar, polished but worn at the edges, mirrored the scarred hands of the man who would hold it soon. Suddenly, a stagehand whispered, "Maybe he shouldn't go out tonight." But Elvis, barely acknowledging the words, tilted his head, a ghost of a smile crossing his lips. The words weren't meant for him. He had already made his decision long before the first caution had been voiced. This was no longer about the body or the fear. This was about the soul. And then it happened. The crowd outside shifted, an audible ripple of expectation moving through the house. Lights blazed. Spotlights stretched toward the wings, waiting. And Elvis, heart hammering, took the first full step onto the stage. Every muscle ached. Every fiber of his body protested. And yet he was there. He raised the microphone, and the moment of truth arrived. His hands shook. His breath caught. But his voice. Pause when it came. It was not the smooth, flawless voice of a man in full health. It was raw. It was human. Every note carried the ache of a life fully lived at losses. The triumphs, the missed nights, the regrets tucked in quiet corners. Every person in the audience could feel it, even if they couldn't name it. He sang not with power but with truth. Each word was deliberate, a confession as much as a performance. The scarf, now resting against the microphone stand, became the anchor of this truth, the bridge from Act Two, a symbol of fragility turned into courage. Every listener could see it, even if only subconsciously. The boy from Tupelo, the man who had carried the world and the human being beneath it all, and then came the disruption. Midway through a note, his voice wavered, not dramatically, but just enough to silence the band. Just enough to silence the murmurs in the crowd. A faint gasp passed through the audience dyne, almost imperceptible, but the backstage crew froze, knowing that this wasn't performance anymore. This was survival, one note at a time. He steadied himself against the mic. Eyes closing, lips trembling, he found the rhythm again, because he had to, but because he chose to. He was declaring silently, without a word, I am here. I am still me. And nothing, not illness, not expectation, not fear, could take that away tonight. The symbolism of the scarf became heavier still. He touched it lightly, letting it rest over his hand as if it carried every audience he had ever moved. Every dream he had ever chased, every night he had ever faced in doubt or despair. It was not just fabric. It was memory, courage, legacy. And as the song continued, every note became a testament not to what he had, but to what he refused to lose, himself. And then the room felt it, the hush. The collective realization that this was not just a concert. This was the culmination of decades, a collision of hope and grief, the human heart exposed in front of thousands. The audience outside, sensing the intensity, leaned in closer, unaware of the fragility behind the glow of the lights. And backstage, the crew held their breath, waiting for what might come next. Each line of the song became heavier, not with volume, but with weight. Each note was a heartbeat, each pause a confession. Tears pooled in the corners of faces, hands gripped seats. And somewhere in the middle of it all, Elvis's eyes flicked briefly to the shadows, those who had cared for him, who had watched him rise, who had silently feared for this night, and he nodded, ever so slightly. Not to acknowledge fear, but to affirm courage. This was the turning point. Crescendo. The moment when every open loop from Act One, the silence. The hallway tension, the first choice to step forward, was now fully in motion. The audience would not yet know, the world outside would not yet realize, but backstage, everyone knew that what they were witnessing was historic. Something fragile had become extraordinary. Something human had become legendary. And as the final notes of this act rolled into the hall, soft but heavy, one thing was clear. This night was no ordinary night. Every beat, every tremor, every flicker of the scarf, every echo of the guitar, every pause between words, it all spoke to a man who had faced his mortality and decided to stand anyway. Elvis Presley. Fragile, human, unbroken, was rewriting the rules of courage in real time. There was a strange tightness in the air that night, the kind of stillness, older. Southerners used to call the quiet before God tests a man.
Elvis
felt it first, not in the noise, not in the crowd, but in the way the hallway seemed to breathe differently around him. He stepped backstage after the final note, sweat still on his brow, the cape hanging heavy on his shoulders. From the outside, everything looked perfect. A roaring house, a flawless show, legend walking like royalty through a corridor lined with stage lights. But on the inside, something felt tilted, off balance. Like the room itself knew what Elvis did. When he reached for the door to his private lounge, his hand paused mid-air. There was movement inside, soft, muffled, wrong. Elvis opened the door, slow and steady, and what he saw stopped him cold. A group of men, the very people who were supposed to protect him, stood crowded around his personal things, papers, tapes, even private letters from his mama spread out across the table like evidence in some secret trial. Their faces weren't ashamed. They weren't surprised. They were angry. Almost victorious the moment Elvis stepped inside. One of them said it bold as daylight. "You ain't in control no more." Elvis didn't shout, didn't step back, didn't tremble. He just stood there, quiet. The way a man does when he realizes the betrayal didn't come from outsiders. It came from the people he trusted to walk behind him. The hallway lights flickered above him, casting long shadows across the room, and for a moment, Elvis felt like he was staring at strangers wearing the uniforms of his own crew. One man, the tallest, the one who had been with Elvis for years, held a reel tape between his fingers. A reel containing new music Elvis hadn't let anyone hear yet. Something deeply personal. Something he'd been shaping for months. He waved it like a trophy. Like a threat. Like leverage. And that was when Elvis finally moved. He stepped forward, slow, firm, grounded in that old-school dignity that older fans still remember. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "Put it down," he said. Simple, steady, unshakable. But the man didn't put it down. He smirked. The kind of smirk that tells you this wasn't a moment of heat. This was planned, practiced, expected. Someone had fed them false promises, told them Elvis was finished, told them they deserved more than loyalty. The betrayal wasn't sudden. It was organized. And Elvis realized he was standing in the middle of a mutiny. The room tightened around him, their shoulders squaring, feet shifting, their eyes cold with resentment. These weren't guards anymore. They were men convinced they had power. And yet, Elvis didn't step back. Not 1 inch. He took the tape gently from the man's hand, not with force, but with the controlled strength of someone who knows exactly who he is and what he's worth. "You boys forgot something," Elvis said softly. "You didn't build this. I did." A hush dropped so heavy it felt like the walls were listening, and that was when the situation exploded. One of the guards lunged forward, a quick, angry move Elvis didn't see coming. Another tried to block the doorway. The whole room shifted into chaos, with bodies stumbling and voices rising, until Elvis found himself surrounded, cornered, pushed into the very space that once felt like his sanctuary. But even then, even in that moment when every man in that room was against him, Elvis stood tall. A legend doesn't bow. Not to fame. Not to fear. Not to betrayal. And that night, when everything turned inside out, Elvis made a choice that shaped the rest of this story. The choice that no one in that room expected. A choice that still keeps older fans talking about this incident with the same whispering. Disbelief they had the first time they heard it, because Elvis Presley didn't just survive that confrontation. He did something far more shocking, something that would change the fate of every man in that room, and expose the truth the world was never supposed to know. And that turning point, is where everything truly begins.
If anyone thought Elvis was done backstage, they were wrong. Right at that moment, with sweat dripping, pulse racing, and betrayal in the air, he made a choice no one saw coming. And what he did next didn't just shock the men around him, it stunned the world. Older fans still talk about this like a secret, like a memory too heavy to forget. The room was frozen. The men who had tried to corner him didn't move. The tension hung thick, like fog in a Louisiana swamp. Every step, every breath, every micro gesture Elvis made was magnified in that space. And his hand, the same hand that had held a microphone for decades, the same hand that had shaped music for millions, now hovered just above a reel, a scarf, a guitar, the symbols of his life. Elvis exhaled slowly, not for calm, not for rest, but because he had made a decision. One that had been forming quietly, inside him, through every note, every tour, every sleepless night behind the bright lights of the stage. And then he spoke, softly, measured, the kind of voice that commands attention without a single shout. "If I leave tonight, it will be on my terms, not anyone else's." The words rippled across the room like a quiet explosion. He stepped towards the center of the space, deliberate, controlled, a rhythm that only a man who has carried a lifetime of expectation could command. His legs trembled slightly, his heart pounded, but his spirit? Unbreakable. Then he did something nobody expected. He picked up his guitar, the same one he had hugged in quiet dressing rooms, strummed alone late at night when no one could hear. The instrument felt familiar, comforting, a reminder of every beginning he had ever had. And yet, tonight, it was more than music. It was a declaration, a symbol, a lifeline. He strummed once. The single note hung in the air, silent, heavy, powerful. It was the kind of sound that makes grown men stop breathing for a moment. The room leaned in, every eye fixed. Every person realized this wasn't about a show. This was about proving to himself that he was still here, that he still mattered. Someone whispered behind him, "Elvis, you don't have to do this." He didn't turn. He didn't flinch. He only lifted his head, eyes steady, voice calm yet firm. "I have to, because if I don't, I lose myself." And then the world outside the closed doors felt a tremor it couldn't explain. Elvis started to play, not with the precision of rehearsed perfection, but with the raw heartbeat of a man fighting for his identity. Each note, each chord carried the weight of decades. Every flick of his wrist, every whisper of melody was a testament to survival, to choice, to defiance. The scarf he had held on stage earlier, now draped across the guitar, a quiet anchor. A symbol from Act 2, remembered in the soft curve of memory. A callback, something personal, something that reminded him and everyone who knew of the journey that had brought him here. He played with intensity that belied his weakened body. A tremor ran through his arm, but not through his resolve. His breathing was shallow, deliberate, and yet there was no fear, only purpose. And as the last note hung in the air, the men in the room understood the magnitude. Not the music, not the showmanship, but the courage, the fight. The fact that even in betrayal, exhaustion, and pain, Elvis had chosen himself. One of the men stepped forward, voice shaky. "Elvis, I didn't know." Elvis looked at him. His gaze wasn't angry, not bitter, just profound. A lifetime of lessons in one look. "Now you know." It wasn't a victory over them. It wasn't even a performance for anyone. It was the choice to stand when every instinct screamed to fall. And in that room, in that single quiet act, the tide shifted. He placed the guitar down gently. He folded the scarf. He straightened his jacket. And though his body ached, his eyes still burned with fire. The silent recognition passed between them. The same men who had tried to corner him now saw clearly. This was not a man who could be contained. Not by illness, not by betrayal, not by anyone. Elvis walked towards the door, each step deliberate, heavy with consequence, light with grace. And as he opened it, the hallway seemed different, the air itself acknowledging the choice he had made. He paused just for a breath, just for a heartbeat, and whispered quietly, almost to himself, "This is mine, every last note, every last night." No applause, no cheers, just quiet respect, awe, and the deep understanding that something monumental had occurred. Something the world outside the walls would never fully grasp, but that those who had witnessed it would never forget. He stepped forward into the corridor, and in that moment, everything shifted. Not just for him, not just for the men who had confronted him, but for the story itself. Because sometimes the turning point isn't loud, it's quiet, it's deliberate, it's personal, and it changes everything. The hallway was quiet now, almost sacred. The faint echo of Elvis's last chord from the guitar lingered in the air, wrapping the space in a fragile glow. Every sound felt magnified. The soft shift of a jacket, the creak of a floorboard, the distant hum of the stage lights. He paused at the threshold of the room that had become his private sanctuary over the years. The room where memories were kept, not the applause. Inside, the scarf lay folded neatly on a chair, the guitar leaning gently against the wall. Every symbol of his life was there, waiting, like old friends ready to witness his quiet triumph. Elvis approached slowly, hand hovering over the guitar strings for just a second, as if to reconnect with all the years those strings had carried him. He remembered that first night he picked it up, trembling with hope and fear, unsure if anyone would ever hear him. Now, decades later, the same instrument bore the weight of every choice, every risk, every moment he had ever lived for music. He touched the scarf gently, a soft, reverent gesture. This was the scarf from Act 2, the one that had trembled in his hands backstage when the world was pressing in. The same scarf he had draped over the guitar in Act 5, marking the turning point. The major symbolism now fully realized. It wasn't just cloth, it was a map of his life, a quiet testament to perseverance, to courage, to identity. For a long moment, he simply stood there, taking in the stillness. The echoes of previous applause, the faint memories of distant cheers, the invisible weight of millions of hearts he had touched. It all wrapped around him like a gentle cloak. Then he exhaled, slow, deep, purposeful. Not because the fight was over, but because he had acknowledged it. He had owned it. And in that acknowledgement came the realization. He was leaving a legacy that could never be erased. He picked up the guitar again, strummed lightly, just a single chord this time. Not for performance, not for audience, but for memory. For the boy from Tupelo who once held this instrument with trembling hands. For the young man who had learnt what it meant to risk everything for passion. For the artist who had walked through every stage, every city, every heart with unrelenting devotion. A faint smile crossed his face, a smile not for the world, not for the legend, but for himself. A small, knowing smile, the kind that carries decades of love, loss, triumph, and reflection all at once. He remembered the first open loop from Act 1, the doctor's words, the 6 months prognosis. He remembered the second, the hesitation backstage, the trembling hand, the question of whether he could stand, whether he could perform. And the third, the choice he made at the turning point, reaching for the guitar and the scarf, reclaiming control of his own story. All resolved now, not with noise, not with dramatics, but quietly, profoundly, fully. He set the guitar down and looked toward the window. The stage lights outside, now fading, mirrored the soft glow of the morning. The crowd beyond would never know the full story of this night. But that was fine. They never needed to. The story belonged to him, to those who had witnessed it, to the music itself. Every symbol he had touched, the scarf, the guitar, the echoes of his footsteps, had been a bridge. A bridge from the fragility of Act 2 through the turning point of Act 5 to this moment of reflection. A life woven into symbols, each one carrying the weight of memory, love, and courage. He whispered softly, almost to himself, I leave it all here, in the music, in the memories, in the choices. And in that whisper was a lifetime of humanity. Not a king, not a legend, just a man, just Elvis. A man who had dared to defy expectation, who had chosen courage over comfort, who had performed for his own soul before anyone else. The room was silent, not the hush of fear, but the quiet of reverence. And outside, the faint echo of applause from the previous act seemed to blend with the distant hum of the world. A warm, comforting reminder that life, like music, leaves traces long after the notes fade. Elvis exhaled one final time, slow, heavy, light, every emotion wrapped into a single human breath. And as he leaned back in his chair, letting the weight of years and choices settle, the room felt whole, balanced, complete. He rose slowly, almost ceremoniously. The fading spotlight outside mirrored the inner light that had guided him through every challenge. Each step he took from that room carried pride, reflection, and an unspoken message. Legacy is not built on applause, but on courage, choice, and the quiet moments we claim for ourselves. And as he disappeared from view, leaving the room as it had been, symbols intact, memories preserved, silence reigning, it was clear. The story of that night and of the man who lived it would echo far beyond the stage, beyond the lights, beyond the years. The room was empty now. The soft hum of the fading spotlight lingered like a memory brushing the edges of a dream. Every breath, every footstep, every whisper from earlier had dissolved into the quiet. And yet, the weight of that night remained. Not in noise, not in applause, but in something far subtler. Something you feel deep in your chest, the place where stories live long after they are told. Elvis's choices, his courage, his quiet defiance, all of it left a mark. A reminder that life is fragile, but also fiercely ours to shape. He had faced the impossible, a countdown of months, and instead of surrendering, he chose to live. Fully, humanly, bravely. And in that, there was a lesson. A model stitched into every strum of his guitar, every trembling note, every silent pause. Life is not measured by how much time we are given, but by how fully we claim it. He might have walked away from the stage that night, unseen, unheard. But in doing so, he left a legacy louder than any spotlight could ever project. A story of hope amidst fragility, of pride born from reflection, of music that carries memory beyond mortality. In that quiet, the audience of the world, those watching, listening, remembering, could feel it. Even without seeing, even without knowing the full story, the essence lingered. Courage is quiet. Bravery doesn't always wear a crown. Legacy is built in the spaces between noise and applause. Elvis leaned back in the chair he had left earlier, fingers brushing the guitar strings one last time. The scarf, folded neatly beside him, seemed to sigh along with him. And the soft, fading spotlight painted him not as a king, not as a myth, but as a man. A man who had loved, risked, and given everything to the music and the people who loved him. And there's something comforting in that truth. Even as time passes, even as voices fade, stories like his echo. In living fully, in choosing courage over fear, in leaving behind symbols, songs, and memories, we continue to teach, to inspire, to remind others what it means to be human. For anyone watching tonight, anyone remembering Elvis in their hearts, the takeaway is simple. Cherish the moments you have. Stand for what you love. Let the music of your own life play loudly, even when the world expects silence. And maybe, in some small way, you'll hear him. The boy from Tupelo, the man on the stage, the legend in our memories, whispering, "Keep going, don't stop, make your story yours." And with that, the echoes faded. The spotlight dimmed, the guitar rested, the scarf remained folded, and the quiet stretched, soft and infinite, into memory.